Thanks for the invitation to speak. Thanks for your interest in my work, and welcome to you all, our good friends and colleagues from, if not all over the world, then at least a number of very different interesting locations. The title of my presentation, as you can see, is The Skeptical Turn in Evaluation. And as Brad said, you're welcome to drop a comment in the chat box. And if I unintendedly ignore it along the way, maybe we can take it up during the Q&A session. I intend to speak for no more than 30 minutes, so there should be ample time for our discussions and reflections and perhaps some joint interpretations of the phenomena that come up. Let me start with a real-life observation that happened in my country. As part of the fiscal law for 2025, this year, the government in Denmark cut 1,000 jobs. Almost all of them were in areas of work like evaluation, inspection, and accreditation. Now, you could, of course, say, what a great misunderstanding of this government that they would cut these very, very important jobs in areas we think are just so critical to the betterment of the world. Nevertheless, perhaps this is something that we as evaluators have to live with, that we cannot command more and more jobs in evaluation, more and more activity in evaluation. And maybe events like that, sad as they are, maybe they are a sign, a symbol, an indication, a symptom of something that we need to interpret in this world. Nevertheless, regardless of how we interpret it, it is a fact in my country that we cannot expect just more jobs, more activity, more resources committed to evaluation. Let me share an interpretation of a fact like this with you today. I use a very simple outline. First, why would I interpret this phenomenon in the light of what I call the skeptical turn in evaluation? That commands me to explain how do I think of evaluation and why do I use the term the skeptical turn. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is a very important phenomenon in evaluation, the institutionalization of evaluation. And as a part of that, I want to talk about three issues which I think are critical: the costs of evaluation, the constitutive effects of evaluation, broadly meaning how evaluation helps create new realities, and finally, some of the democratic implications of the institutionalization of evaluation. And finally, perhaps on a little bit more positive note, could I imagine some remedies, some way of moving forward with evaluation and the field of evaluation that take these complications into account? So that's my outline, and I promise to tell you exactly which step I'm covering as we go along. First step first. The introduction. How do I think of evaluation and why do I call it the skeptical turn? I think in my world, evaluation is not only a very discrete and particular identifiable activity as the one you read about in classical textbooks. It is more than that. It is a part of what I call an evaluation society. You can meet evaluation in different forms and shape. It has many faces and it is entangled in many things. For example, when we talk about evaluation culture, it also means, for example, tests and capacity building and quality reports, which is the case in my schools in Denmark when we talk about evaluation culture. All of these other things are coming with it under the umbrella term evaluation culture. We could also meet other terms. Let me give you an example of accreditation, of higher education, for example, in my country. When we talk about accreditation, we would also talk about inspection, monitoring, and, no kidding, no surprise, also student evaluations of the teaching that takes place in classrooms. So evaluation is found on several different levels of analysis as a headline for some other activities or as a part of other activities that have different headlines. That's very important for me to communicate that, because some people tend to think that over here we have evaluation, then we have monitoring, and then we have quality assurance, and they're all separate. I'm not saying that they are one and the same thing. All I'm saying is if we want to analyze evaluation as a part of modern society, we have to understand that it appears with many faces and it is entangled in many kinds of activities under different kinds of headlines. Depending on the analysis you want to carry out, you want to slice and define these things in different ways. I like to look at the broad socio-political picture, covering all of these things together under the broad headline of the evaluation society. I respect that other people have other views. Why the skeptical turn? A turn, I think, is partly something that happens in theory when we start looking at things in other ways because we are applying new kinds of theory to a phenomenon. This often happens in theory. We have the semiotic turn, the symbolic turn, the linguistic turn, etc., in many fields of theory. This is partly, I admit that, due to the theories that I have chosen to read, and maybe I have got an overdose of continental socio-political, socio-philosophical theory. Maybe that has contributed to what I call the skeptical turn. I respect that. But I would also say that there are important theorists, for instance, Michael Power on the Audit Society, that have contributed to looking at evaluative phenomena in a different light as compared to what we did 20 or 40 years ago. I would also argue that there are people within the field of evaluation itself that are trying to apply new theories that help us change perspectives on the phenomenon of evaluation. Now, I'm not going to excel in French because I don't have the capacity to do that, but I looked it up, and prendre un virage means to turn a corner. So we could imagine that when we turn a corner, we can look down different alleys and see things from different perspectives. So I like that metaphor very much. By turning a corner and maybe making a change of directions. I would also argue that it is not only a matter of subjective perspective and theory choices. It is also a matter of evaluation itself, which has made a turn, if you allow me that metaphor. It has simply shown another face of itself, and then we can see other aspects of evaluation. That's my argument. So it is not only a matter of the choice of approach, as they would say in North America, it is also a matter, I would argue, of certain socio-political changes with evaluation that allows us to see different parts of evaluation. Why is that? Here is a simple graph of some important tasks that we have been carrying out in evaluation. In the first box, I would argue that a main problem was how to design an evaluation. You could read that in the early textbooks. If you have a particular intended use, you take into account contextual factors, evaluand, the values, the methods. Then most of the basic textbooks in evaluation helped us and our students to design the best possible evaluation under the circumstances. I would argue then that after a couple of years and some decades, there was also an interest in building an evaluation system at looking at more than one evaluation at a time, because organizational learning would only be encouraged and promoted not looking at one evaluation, but looking at how evaluations would unfold in organizations. So that led to an interest in institutionalization of evaluation, in evaluations across time and space, in evaluation capacity building, in evaluation policies, in evaluation systems, and all these things that describe an integrated perspective of more than one evaluation in time and place. And we have very good people among us today in the audience who contributed to thinking systematically about building such systems, policies, structures, and capacities to carry out evaluation. Now, just for the sake of the argument, I would then argue that most of my work today lies in the third box, which is revision of evaluation systems. Looking back on the experiences we have had the last 20 years with how evaluation systems that good people built with good intentions, how they have actually performed in practice. That is, when ministries of education called me today and asked, Peter, would you help us? They asked me to do something in the box number 3, to revise already existing evaluation systems, test systems, monitoring systems, exam systems, etc. Then we have to look at the pros and cons of different systems, including the costs of these systems. We have to look at not only the most intended use for the most intended user, but a whole range of forms of use, including the constitutive effects, which I will come back to. And we will also have to do some, what I would like to call democratic repair work. How can we feed the information that we have learned about evaluation systems? How can we feed that back into political decision-making so that we make these new systems for the future more efficient, more fit for purpose, more lean, more responsive, more democratic, etc., etc. So if we accept that there has been an emphasis in the typical tasks of evaluation, or the most typical task for a given epoch, a given era, I would argue that the experiences we have to deal with in box number 3 would be the reflections we have on how evaluation systems have actually worked in practice over the last 20 years. So we will have to reflect on the systematicity of evaluation in ways which we did not do before, for simple social historical reasons. That's my argument. As we do that, we will have to acknowledge that evaluation systems are philosophically and practically and in their effect distinct from just more of the same or just more evaluations. Why is that? That is because, and here I come to point number 2, that is because we have seen an institutionalization of evaluation, and we have seen its implications. This is now the institutionalization of evaluation is not only anymore an aspiration, it is also a socio-political experience. We have data about that if we open our eyes. We can reflect upon it. We can use that as a source of input in our revision of evaluation systems. What do I mean by institutionalization? What does that imply? It means the integration of evaluation into a number of procedures, making them perhaps routines and organizations. It also means the expansion of evaluation in time and space. For instance, workplace assessments in the European Union applied to more than 200 million workers in 27 countries. So we have large zones in which the same evaluation system is applicable. All of this is supported by infrastructure, indicators, guidelines, computers, policies, technical stuff, hardware and software that supports evaluation systems. And we have also seen to an increasing extent evaluation becoming legally mandated, which means that we don't only do evaluation because we want to gain knowledge. We're also doing evaluation today because every pupil has the right to know his or her evaluation result. Every parent has a right to report coming back to the home saying, how is my little kid in the school doing? So there are some purposes of evaluation which have changed because we're not only doing it to gain knowledge, we're also doing it because somebody has the right to know the results of that evaluation. As an aspect of evaluation institutionalization, we have also seen evaluation becoming depersonalized. It is not only the evaluator as a person who is making ethical choices and methodological choices. It's a huge part of a machinery, and if you replace one person and put another person in, that is not going to change the design of a large evaluation systems. It is other factors. Institutionalization also means that there are many people who have everyday experiences with evaluation, even if they don't know who designed that evaluation system, when and why it was made. People are participating in evaluation without knowing who designed that evaluation and for which purpose. By implication, we also see the social distance between those people who experience evaluation and its result and its impact. For instance, evaluation of kids in the classroom, their lived experience far away from the architects of the evaluation system. And people are not always aware of how to reconnect those two. When OECD designs their huge, big PISA international assessments, there is no way that the Danish teacher who is subject to PISA assessments of their own school children, there is no way that they can know which office in which international town to connect to if they have a complaint about the PISA assessment. This connection is problematic because it is large in time and space. If you will, the interface between the user and the designer of evaluation is so complex that you cannot always make that link. Three implications of this. First of all, there is an implication related to costs. If in the classical textbook we made an evaluability assessment, we could range different objects of evaluation according to how likely it would be to be beneficial to evaluate that thing. It would be highly beneficial if there is a clear purpose, a clear goal, a clear program theory, and somebody willing to use the findings immediately, as compared to situations that are more messy, which have complex and unarticulated goals and no program theory and nobody ready to use the evaluation results. Now, if we add that there are certain costs in, for the sake of the argument, a standardized evaluation where everybody, for institutionalized reasons, are evaluated with the same concept, for instance, a test or a standardized report or something like that, then we will, and I don't go into depth with the exact measurement of particular units here or the measurement scale, just in principle, we would have an evaluation dead weight in situations where we spend more energy on the evaluation as compared to the benefits over on the right-hand side of the graph, as opposed to over on the left-hand, where there is still more benefits than costs. We don't like evaluation dead weights when we evaluate us because people get tired of our work and they don't see the benefits as compared to the time, the energy, the money, and the attention they have to spend on evaluation. So we can reduce it if we reduce the general burden of a standardized evaluation, making it more lean, or we can differentiate so that we spend more of the energy over here where there is a good benefit of evaluation and less over in the right-hand side. At least when we reduce the burden, we also have less evaluation dead weight. So clearly we can reduce the burden in general, which is often not very smart because the objects are uneven, but we could also differentiate. And that would help us at least ameliorate the problem with evaluation dead weight. My argument is we need to be more careful to describe, count, and problematize the costs. And these are not only money and time. This is not only consulting hours, etc. It's also a cost in terms of attention. Attention, according to Nobel Prize winner Herbert Simon and his colleague Jane March, attention may be the most precious resource we have in organizations, even more precious than time and money. So if we borrow people's attention, we need to be really, really sure that it's a good investment. We need to talk about that in evaluation. There has been a tendency that since we believed so much in the benefits of evaluation, we thought that all evaluation made a good difference. Yes, it may, but we need to compare it to the relative costs of evaluation too. We can reduce the burden where possible, or we can make something smarter, differentiate whenever we can, which, however, in my experience, requires quite a lot of courage in practice. It is more difficult than I believe to have staff in a foundation differentiate more sharply, more nuanced between different kinds of projects that deserve evaluation in different ways, in different moments, in different times for different reasons. I think this is the way forward, but it requires more management courage and more administrative courage and more knowledge about evaluation that I would expect. For many, many reasons, many foundations and organizations just simply standardize everything, which maintains the horizontal cost curve. But we should do better than that, I think. Next step, let's look at constitutive effects. By constitutive effects, I mean many, many different things that depend on the many different functions of the system we are looking at. But the common denominator for constitutive effects is that they help constitute new realities. People behave in particular ways in the light of the knowledge that they are now under evaluation. Here is an example from an expert group that I'm just beginning to work with as a chairperson for the Ministry of Education in Denmark. We had another one where we looked at tests. Now we're looking at exams. We made a brainstorm over the functions that exams have in school. It's a proof of learning outcome to the student. It's a proof of learning outcome to employers and institutions. It gives admission to further education. It helps sort students socially. It's also a motivation for some students, demotivation for others. It has washback effects on teaching. It could train students for future exams. It gives status to a particular subject. If you know you have to pass an exam in math, then math becomes more important than music because there is no exam in music. It's a feedback to the teacher about how the teaching, how it worked. It's a feedback to the school. It's a part of monitoring in schools, and it could also be an object of educational research. So over just half an hour, we came up with 12 different functions that the same exam system has. We know, of course, that the emphasis on these different functions is subject to political prioritization, political decisions, and the design of the school system, as well as to the actual practices of teachers and students, etc., etc. But given that quite a few of them are in function already, it gives less meaning to say that we only want to talk about intended use for intended users. My argument is that although it is meaningful to talk about intended use for intended users, it is in fact not the best key to understanding the socio-political implications of evaluations, because there are so many implications of such a complicated system that are entangled in so many pedagogical and administrative and political practices. For that reason, the constitutive effects are also multiple. As said, I think we can conceive of constitutive effects as the construction of reality that flows from the awareness of people being under evaluation. It is far-reaching in time and place because the washback effects on teaching also is a washback effect on the construction of school books, for instance. And I think we can best understand it if we do not make it too coterminous with either the unintended or the intended, or with good or bad effects. I would much rather have that we look at it as something we can do research on, something we can be curious about. In terms of the content of work, the timing of work, the social relations implied, as we know that, for instance, the teacher knows that the student will later evaluate the teacher in a particular way that influences the teacher-student relation. And it also influences the sort of worldview we have of that particular institution under evaluation. So this is, in my little text, in my little view, a sort of checklist of things we can look at if we want to understand the constitutive effects. But I prefer to keep it as something we can be curious about, not something that we a priori have determined is a good thing or a bad thing, or is intended or unintended. In particular, I believe that in a very complex system like this, the distinction between intended and unintended becomes less critical, less important, simply because there are so many intentions that are shifting over time with so many actors. I like to think of constitutive effects not as a way to make use more systematic in advance, but I like to think of it as an invitation to be constantly curious, also constantly collectively curious, collaboratively curious, if you will, about the systemic effects of evaluation. But I think that is an important thing to put on the agenda for evaluators, not only as we construct evaluation systems, but also as we reflect on them and revise them. That's what I would like to see. I think this has democratic implications. With institutionalization, we have seen an increasing distance between those who design evaluation system and the people who live with them in everyday life. Not all of these evaluation systems have built-in feedback mechanisms so that they automatically learn from people under evaluation. We need to improve that. And not all evaluation systems are part of a democratic governance structure. Some are run by private companies where we don't know how the data are produced, who controls it, and who publishes it, and why. Whereas there are some other systems that are part of a democratic governance structure, but where we need to be more clever in using the feedback mechanisms. But I would argue that there is quite a lot of democratic deficit in many evaluation systems as we know them so far. Let's be curious about it. Do not make evaluators blind to the socio-political implications of evaluation. If we can be more attentive to constitutive effects, it does not mean that we are a priori committed to enhancing a particular evaluation, a particular political position, or a distinction between good use and misuse or intended versus unintended use. I think it should be possible to increase the democratic potential of evaluation, even without claiming a particular political position. A sense of society is something we discover through the experience of being exposed to some of the same forces, says Dewey, or said Dewey 100 years ago. I think that's an important piece of information that we can still think of as evaluators, because it shows us the importance of public information and debate. What I would like to see is that when we share an evaluation system, we in fact also share a way of making a society out of that system, although it is not always visible for us, but we need to make that more visible. In a more contemporary version, Rosan Vallon, French political philosopher, talks about democracy as a socio-historical phenomenon. It is not once and for all universally defined, but it is something we can constantly learn and try to improve democracy based on the feedback that this particular time and moment gives us, the particular experiences we have in this moment. And I would argue that learning about the function of evaluation systems in large scale is an important democratic challenge for us that lies for us in our immediate present and future. Finally, what could be some of the remedies? If I'm not totally off with what I've said, what are things we can do? We can show more attention to the costs of evaluation, talk about them, measure them, be aware that they include not only time and money, but also attention. We could show more attention to constitutive effects and the complexities of constitutive effects, because they make a difference for people who are under evaluation systems. We can also reinvent evaluability assessment. If we think more cleverly about evaluability assessment, not at the program level, but at the evaluation systems level, we could perhaps come up with more interesting and complicated algorithms for when is it that when we evaluate this particular thing in this way at this moment and other things in other ways in other moments, rather than having too much standardized evaluation. We can experiment with democratic deliberation in revision of evaluation systems. That's an important democratic endeavor. And we could perhaps also make more sophisticated evaluation policies that not only describe these differentiations, but also describe when and how and why we would engage in reflection about large evaluation systems. So I think, in conclusion, that skeptical doesn't necessarily mean negative. It means that we can see evaluation from a different viewpoint. We can see some of the darker sides, but we can also see things that we need to take into account in the next moment of evaluation. And there is no reason to be negative or pessimistic, because evaluation from its very birth has constantly been thinking about how do we conceive of the next generation of evaluation as we reflect on our experiences. So that will be my concluding slide, except that if you wish, you can also see some references here, and I have no problem with sharing the slides with the organizers. You will get them if you want. Let me stop at this point and open the space for reflections and thoughts and concerns. And if you wish, you can share with the group or with me any observations or any experiences that you may have with evaluation which you think resonate in some way with the skeptical turn, and we can perhaps interpret it in this room if you wish. But you're also welcome to bring up any other issue you may have or any other question.